Hey friends, welcome to Bokeh, a podcast exploring the ever-blurring lines between the personal and business lives of professional photographers. This is your host, Nathan Holritz, and I'm happy that you can join me today in connecting with photographers and entrepreneurs as we discuss photography, business, and, oh yeah, that sometimes messy thing that we call life. This podcast is brought to you by Photographers Edit, custom image editing for the wedding and portrait photographer. Just visit photographersedit.com. All right, Bokeh Podcast listeners, thanks so much for joining us yet again today for another conversation. Actually, I think a relatively fresh and new conversation for all of you out there today. To help us bring that to bear, I've got my friend Morgan Taylor here with me. Morgan, thank you so much for making time for the Bokeh Podcast.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
And we actually had a bit of an unusual opportunity to connect the first time in person back in October. Maybe you can share a little bit with our listeners about that.
Yeah, so a mutual friend, Sean with Kiss Books, he invited us out to a trip in Yosemite. So that was when I got to meet you out there. It was my first time in Yosemite. I know that he's done this trip a couple times, but yeah, that was when I got to meet you out there, and it was a ton of fun.
Yeah, it's something that Sean Austin, who we've had on the podcast multiple times in the past, he and his brother started this tradition of making an annual trip to Yosemite. And I felt very, very privileged to be invited along. And it was a group of, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 of us or so.
Yeah.
A bunch of guys just kind of glamping in Yosemite. And
yeah.
I think I mentioned this the other day on the podcast, but I didn't grow up with a lot of close relationships with guys. For whatever, psychological reasons, we can dig into that another time. Yeah. That just wasn't the norm for me. I just wasn't your typical guy's guy. I played sports and whatnot, but I just didn't have close male friendships for the most part, especially as I got into my teen years and so forth. And so this was really my first opportunity to kind of explore that realm a little bit, like go really hang out with guys, get dirty, stinky, going hiking, for miles on end, but ultimately just really share the camaraderie that comes from, certainly shared interests in many cases, or many of the people that were there are photographers like yourself. And so we could share in that, but it was just a really cool experience overall. Absolutely stunning. For those of you listening in, if you've never been to Yosemite before, this was not my first time, but it was certainly my first time as an adult, and I was just blown away. I was like a kid in a candy shop, just soaking in the scenery all around me. And I think Morgan, you were part of when we went hiking one day, I think 18 miles, something like that, up to Half Dome, and you were part of a group that was kind of lagging behind, but largely because you guys were so excited about taking pictures of everything along the way, right?
Yeah, so that was actually a rough one for me. I love hiking. I grew up going outdoors and doing all this fun stuff. But when I was younger, I actually suffered from asthma. And now it just comes up every now and again. And for some reason on that hike, maybe got like a quarter of the way up, maybe not even that, and I just couldn't breathe. I was wheezing. I was struggling.
Oh, that's right.
A couple of the guys lagging behind. We were all taking pictures and doing all this stuff. And I ended up turning back. So I didn't make the Half Dome hike.
Oh, I didn't mean to highlight that. Yeah. No, I totally forgot about that piece of it. Yeah, I was just thinking you were part of that group with Mike Cologne, who we also just recently had in the podcast.
Yeah, and I think Stuart and Daniel and there's Brandon.
Bunch of them. Yeah, that's right. Man, asthma can be such a beast. My brother, I have 3 younger brothers, and my brother Jason grew up with asthma. I mean, and it was so serious that we actually ended up spending about 6 weeks in Denver one summer, where he was at a really special treatment center. They were running all kinds of tests and trying to get to the bottom of it all, because it just had such a significant effect on his life. And of course that trickles down to family life as well. But I absolutely empathize with you, and that can be tough. And it sucks to kind of miss out on opportunities to be able to do things like hiking, maybe especially the longer distances like that. But nonetheless, it was incredible. I mean, even the views from our campsite, I mean, you basically step outside where we were staying for the night and walk down to the river, and you look up and you see these massive, massive mountains. Pretty much anywhere you take a picture, it looked like a postcard. So it was an incredible experience. When
you walked in the spot where we were, the river was 25 feet away. Yeah. You walk down to the river and you can actually see Half Dome to the right.
Yep.
And if you walk out a little bit more, you can see El Capitan, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely.
So El Cap is right there, and it was the perfect spot. It was so great.
Incredible. Yeah, I can't wait to go back again. I think it's going to be an amazing experience, not only to be able to potentially share with you guys, but others as well. I know even my kids have never been, and to be able to take them out there would be really great. But nonetheless, really cool opportunity to get to connect with you there in person. And as I mentioned, you're a photographer, and so we're just going to kind of dive into conversation as normal here at the Bokeh Podcast with what lately we've been talking about, something called a technique for time or tool for time. And I'm curious, is there a particular, maybe a workflow tip or trick that you utilize, maybe a particular tool that you utilize to create more freedom, more space in your life as a business owner?
Yeah. So first of all, get married and let your wife plan things for you. But on another note there, one thing I've learned is you got to manage your time like you manage your finances. If you spend money you don't have, you're going to be in debt. If you spend time you don't have, you're going to be in debt. So budgeting your time, blocking certain things out so that you can, setting a time for edits, setting a time for a photo shoot, setting a time for your family, setting a time for you to just go play Scrabble at a coffee shop, Yeah.
And it's interesting because, first of all, my almost immediate thought was, hopefully many of you aren't budgeting the time the way a lot of photographers, I think, are budgeting their finances. Unfortunately, it's not always our strongest suit. And I speak from personal experience. It was certainly a weakness of mine as a photographer. But I guess the correlation between finances and time is that we're talking about something that we can't get back of, right? It's a limited resource. And once we spend it, it's gone. And unlike money, we certainly can't get it back. There are opportunities potentially to get some of that back when it comes to finances. But once we spend that time, it's gone. So how are we allocating that time to the various aspects of our personal life, to our business life? That idea of actually budgeting it, I don't think I've heard any of our guests refer to it in that way. And I like that thought process.
Yeah, and it's definitely a helpful tool along the same lines of that, being flexible when things change, and knowing how to manage that as well. There's been times where you'll set up a meeting with a photographer or with a client, and I've gotten to the coffee shop and, hey, we're 2 hours late. All right. Well, then what I'll do in that case is I usually have my laptop with me and I'll pull it out and edit some photos while I wait for him, and then free up time later in my editing or something like that, or just go back to Yosemite. When I came down from the mountain, I spent some time with myself, had a couple hours that I pulled out my laptop and finished up a wedding.
Yeah, I think really a lot of that comes back to, and this is probably a topic that we could stand to do another episode or two at least on the idea, first of all, when it comes to managing time effectively, of kind of having an overall, it's something we talk about a lot here on the podcast, a big picture view, kind of overarching goals. What you're reaching toward, because that will then drive the business model that you create, and then subsequently it will drive how you spend your day, your hours, as long as you're actually thinking that way as a business owner. And the cool thing about that is exactly what you just described, which is that if you know what you're reaching toward, then you know how you should spend your time, and that should drive maybe your to-do list, your task and project management lists. And if you do have free time, you can just jump to that, I like that very proactive mentality, because it's easy, and I've certainly been guilty of it. It's easy to get frustrated in the moment when somebody shows up late to a meeting, or there's a delay, even like driving in traffic. I don't live very far from Atlanta, and I get so frustrated at times when I'm down in Atlanta with how much time I guess I get stuck in traffic, and the car's moving slowly, and I'm just, the notion that I'm kind of forced to sit in this time suck of a situation. It's so frustrating. But even in that scenario, I can be proactive and take advantage of the time to listen to a business book or a podcast or something that could help me personally. There's always opportunities, if we're thinking proactively, to take advantage of time and let that benefit us on multiple levels. And so I like that mentality. But this is good. I'm glad that we're starting here. The notion of budgeting time, for those of you listening in, if you're not doing that, then again, I would encourage you, first of all, to be very clear about what you're even trying to accomplish with your personal life, which translates to what you're doing with your business, which translates to the business model, which translates or should translate to how you're spending your time on a daily basis. If you're clear about that, then it won't be difficult to, first of all, budget your time. And if you see open spots of time, to take advantage of that, either for the sake of your personal life, your personal relationships, or for your business. So, wow, I think we could we could stop the podcast episode there, and our listeners could walk away with something really valuable. But that's really, really good. Speaking of free time, how do you like to spend it besides going to Yosemite?
So besides going to Yosemite, I love being outdoors and camping and tree climbing. I love the gear side of that.
I was blown away by the amount of gear, or kind of the obsession with gear. And I think this is very commonplace for photographers anyway. We get excited about all the gear, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
It was really funny actually to listen to and watch these conversations around camping gear during this trip to Yosemite. And some of the stuff that you guys pulled out was pretty incredible. I mean, even a hammock, like these fancy hammocks that become tents. I don't know that I'd ever seen anything like that before.
Well, it's funny because we had cots, but we all hung up our hammocks instead. It was like a spider web of hammocks.
It was really quite interesting. I was very simple. I had a simple sleeping bag on the cot. As I said, we were kind of glamping, but yeah, some of the gear was a lot of fun. But you said you like to get outdoors. Is that something that your wife shares with you as well?
No, not in the slightest.
Okay.
Which is fine. It's just not who she is as far as camping.
Yeah. There's a significance to, and we've talked about this before on the podcast, but the significance to individuality in relationships that's actually really healthy for relationships. So you've got certain outlets maybe that you enjoy. Maybe she has the same thing, and so no, that's cool. So you said you'd like to get outdoors. How else do you like to spend time?
Yeah, so I love being with my wife and doing things with my wife. One thing we'll do is I live up here in the Great Pacific Northwest in Washington, and I live right by Lake Washington, and we have what's called a Log Boom Park is right there, and there's this like bike path, walking path. So my wife and I will get our longboards and we'll just go skate down the path and stop off at a Starbucks or a brewery and grab a beer and skate back. And one of those things are just so fun. So I guess that's some outdoor stuff that she likes doing.
Yeah, but and I love the simple activities that let you enjoy, like you said, the outdoors, the scenery. I mean, that area is just stunning visually. But then it gives opportunity for just doing something together and potentially conversation. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and in times where maybe we don't have bad weather, or it's really hot, we'll just go to a coffee shop and bring Scrabble and play Scrabble or something like that.
Yep. I've found that games are a really great point of conversation for me and my kids.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, even just sitting down and playing a game of poker can be so much fun. And of course, innate to that experience then is the conversation that ensues. Maybe even a little bit of trash talking as well.
Yeah. Both my wife and I are pretty sarcastic.
Yeah. Sarcasm is so much fun, especially when used right. What's something that most people don't know about you? Just kind of a random fact. I mean, I like for our listeners to get to know our guests. So surprise us with something random.
Yeah. My mom was an artist and I grew up painting.
Really?
And I've done a couple commission things. I have something coming up here pretty soon, actually, where I will be painting on a big piece of wood with wood stain. So something I started doing a few years ago, and it's been really cool. Painting with wood stain is wildly different than acrylic or oil or anything like that.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But it's pretty cool. It's a lot of fun. But yeah, I grew up painting, and that's what I did before photography actually too. It's just painting and sketching and all sorts of different things like that. It's a lot of fun. So yeah, I grew up a painter.
So is this something, I mean, you mentioned this commission that you have coming up, but this is something that you practice actively on the side? Is it just another kind of escape? It has kind of a negative connotation, but just an outlet for you to express your artistic side that you do on a regular basis? Yeah.
So it's more of an outlet that I do pseudo regular basis.
Okay.
Yeah. When my free time isn't taken up with camping and skateboarding and Scrabble, I try to get out and plan some stuff and sketch it out and then get to painting it, some stuff like that. So
that's really cool. And I'm sure it lends an interesting perspective to being a photographer. And speaking of which, I'm curious how you got started as a photographer and talk to us a little bit about how long you've been in business as well. Yeah.
So I've been in business since 2007 was my first wedding. And I became a photographer in 2006.
Okay.
I used to manage a skateboard shop called Pharmacy Board Shop in Victorville, California. And I was skateboarding with a friend who worked there, and he handed me his camera. His name's Corey. He handed me his camera, and he's like, "Hey, take some pictures of me." And I took some pictures of him. He's like, "This is really good. You should do this." So at the time, I didn't have a ton of money, and the owner of Pharmacy actually financed my first camera. It was the
Really?
Canon. Yeah, it was a Canon 30D.
Okay.
With 50 millimeter 1.8 plastic lens.
Yes.
And I started taking pictures, and he actually, the owner, Donnie is his name, was getting married, and they had hired a photographer, and he's said, "Hey, you should take pictures at my wedding too. Why not?" And so I did. And it turned out that they didn't actually get many photos from the photographer. The photos weren't very good, and they ended up liking my photos more. And so I was like, "Hey, this was fun. I think I did a pretty good job. Maybe I can make some money doing this." And so I started shooting weddings.
Wow. Okay. So how long did it take you to go full time then?
I'm actually not full time.
Okay. So
I've been able to budget and do maybe about 6 to 10 weddings a year. And I'm kind of at a nice, comfortable spot there. And I've been playing with the idea of going full time and doing that. But since I would say 2008, I've been pretty consistent, at least, building up a few things here and there.
Okay, cool. So that begs the question, of course, what do you have an additional job, something else that you're working full time or part time?
Yeah. So I've done a few things here and there, anywhere from, doing managing the skateboard shop to being a hemodialysis technician to doing some home maintenance stuff. And currently I'm working with this company called Evermark, and they do some promotional items for businesses and companies, and they do signage for apartments and stuff. So I am a project manager with them, helping out some of the sales team and making sure stuff gets done.
Wow, that's okay. So you have these other jobs, and I love the wide variety of them too. It sounds like you're a curious individual, to say the least. But how do you manage to? I mean, we were talking about the idea of time. How do you manage to kind of balance working another job with also trying to run a photography business? I mean, is it a matter just of budgeting that time, like you described earlier?
Yeah, and that's what it is, and it works out well. The people who I work for these companies, they know that I'm a wedding photographer, and it's kind of part of the agreement. And hey, I'm going to have to take certain days off to shoot these weddings. Obviously, you'll be in the loop, and I'll let you know. But it's, typically it's on weekends, and sometimes I'll do some editing on my lunch breaks, or in the evenings I'll have a couple days planned out where I'll do some editing. Or if I get, too busy and get a lot of weddings, is something I've been considering is photographer's edit, and wanting to explore that a little bit to help lighten some of the load. But typically I've been editing myself and budgeting that time.
Yeah, I'm not a great multitasker, and I'm continually reminded of this. And in fact, when I first started, when I was in college, actually, I'm going way back. When I was in college, I got married after my junior year, and then I was working full time, and just having gotten married, and then going to school full time as well. And I had to realize, I just can't effectively do all of these things at once. I mean, I was only 20, but I've not, that's just not been a strength of mine. And so kudos to you for, again, just being proactive in the way that you've been able to manage your time and maintain a business in addition to working other jobs. It says a lot about the effectiveness of that very idea of budgeting your time. But take us back to the photography business. What is your business's brand position? How do you differentiate yourself from other photographers there in the Washington market?
Yeah, so I think from the start, when you start out, you want to try to do everything everyone is doing. But I feel like quickly learned that fads are a very real thing in photography, and you have filters, and you have, this trend and this trend. And while that is great and people love that stuff, that wasn't really, who I wanted to be. And I came across this phrase, and I can't for the life of me remember who said it, but he said that photographers are the workhorses of history. And that makes a lot of sense. The silent workhorses of history, rather. It makes a lot of sense, because what we do, we, take a photo and we capture a memory to last. And I kind of took the concept of of that lasting memory, and decided I want to shoot as natural as I can, as real as I can, as timeless as I can, so that my photo will look great now, and then 30 years down the road, it's still going to be something you want hung up in your house. It's still going to be that picture in your album you want to look at.
Yeah, and not with the weird filter that happened to be popular for a year.
Right. So I kind of just decided that's going to be my mantra, my timeless. What I'm going to shoot towards is going to be timeless.
And do you find that you miss out at all? I mean, when you're looking at the industry, the conversations that are happening within the industry, but then ultimately, of course, I mean, having a conversation with our photographer peers about what is popular right now it's a whole different thing than actually understanding what our clients want and are going to be happy with. Have you found, I mean, is there any sense that you're missing out as a result of not following these trends or fads when it comes to actually building and even maintaining your photography business?
No, not necessarily. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One, some of them I just don't like. I just don't like the look of them. I understand that other people like it, and that's great. That's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Personal preference, I wouldn't want to hang it on my wall, Yeah. And that kind of helps me feel like I'm not missing out or anything. But there are some stuff that, does look good. Like right now, people are kind of wanting to do a little more of a film kind of look, but kind of bring it to the extreme. But like, I'll take elements of that and incorporate them and allow those elements to kind of be timeless, and it's so there's a lot of learning that can happen with them, and I'll explore them. I'll edit photos. Like I'll pull out a fad and just see if I can do it.
Yeah.
Because you learn.
Yeah, you do learn. And I think that open-mindedness is truly important. But I wonder too, how much of these fads are driven just by sheer boredom, like photographers, because we have a tendency, and I can speak from experience. Like we do something even for a week and you're like, oh, I'm bored with this. Let's try something else just to spice things up, mix things up a little bit. Like I wonder how many of these fads actually come from boredom, because of course the reality is that most clients don't really care about all these nuanced differences in processing and these Lightroom presets that we all get excited about. At the end of the day, they just want a decent picture, a positive experience, a finished product that they can look back on and maybe relive those memories. It's pretty simple. And we as photographers kind of complicate that process. And unfortunately, to the detriment of having a life ultimately many times. But I think keeping an open mind and at least being open to new ideas. I mean, it's certainly, I can't emphasize the importance of that enough. It's so important, especially as a business owner, because you can get left behind when it comes to things that actually do translate to whether or not you're able to grow your business. So open mind, always important. How do you communicate that idea of being timeless though to your clients or to your potential clients?
Yeah. So I think a big part of that is, people will see my photos and just like them and be drawn to them and know that they like them. They may not know exactly why, but they know that there's something in them that they like. So for instance, I actually just got a contract signed with a client coming up here in September, I believe. She was going through, her and her fiance were going through a few different photographers. One, they kind of liked the person and his personality, but they didn't like his photos. Another, they kind of liked his photos, weren't sold on him, but the guy was kind of a jerk. And then they found me on social media through an ad I did, and loved my photos. Like, I just love this kind of simple, timeless look. And I got to talking to her about them. They wanted to meet me, and we actually just talked about life, and this very different meeting that I've had. Is very personal, and which is great. I think relationship is important when you're taking photos. But one thing they said is we love your photos, and I can't pinpoint it. And what I told them was like, well, it's because I'm not in your photos. I'm taking the picture, but you aren't. When you look at it, you're not looking at it like there's a photographer there. You're not looking at it like there's someone with a camera taking a picture. You're looking at it like you're just there. You just are in that moment. And I am absent of that moment, which is something I strive to do, because, I mean, if you want to look at a picture for a piece of art that you're going to hang on your wall or the photographer is very present, there is a time and a place for that, sure. But when I'm photographing someone's wedding, when I'm taking pictures of them and their wedding, they want to preserve that memory as how it was. They don't want to preserve the memory with, hey, it was me, my husband, and the photographer, because we clearly, it's just, there's a difference.
There is a difference, and it's an interesting conversation that also warrants probably at least another podcast episode. But
yeah,
there's photographers have become very self-important in the way that they handle, particularly shooting weddings in the last number of years, what they expect from the client versus going into it trying to figure out any and every possible way that they can focus on serving that client, and simultaneously being that very thing that you just described, which is almost the fly on the wall, right? That you are that silent photographer in the background, capturing the moments, rather than trying to establish some kind of presence and make sure that the client is serving you. I've been confused by that mentality, that thought process. We're ultimately hired to do a job, and hopefully much of that job consists or is centered around the idea of silently capturing the moments for the sake of these subjects, who then will ideally be able to share in those memories for years and years to come. And that should be the primary focus. It's not about the photographer, it's about the client. So I love that mentality and that approach.
Really quick with that, something I want to point out is with the fly in the wall mentality, I feel like, I think that's very important, but I kind of take a little different approach with that. Instead of, a fly on the wall, I kind of am camouflaged.
Okay.
Because I think it's, for me at least, important to be there and be present and be involved, but still not be just the photographer that stands out. And a lot of this comes in just developing relationship, whether it's a quick relationship or something that's longer. But I've had several times people tell me, it's like, if you weren't taking our pictures, we just want to invite you to the wedding. And I think it's important to kind of, for me at least, to be that kind of person that is, not just the guy in the background taking pictures, but I'm a part of the wedding. I would just be there. Like, they love having me there just because it's fun and it's good to be there. So you kind of put on a camouflage with that, you're one of the guests, but you're also taking the photos. Well,
and to be clear, I have to make sure that I'm not coming across the wrong way to anyone listening, that there is certainly a balance, as you kind of alluded to, between being that silent photographer who is camouflaged in the background, and then also understanding that the relationship that you have with these clients is important. The way that you interact, not only with the clients but also with the guests, is extremely important. I'm thinking a little bit more about the conversation that seems to be a really popular one. At least it was there for some time, about the types of meals that photographers were being served, as though they deserved, some. I mean, it's funny. My son, actually, who's 16, just went in for a second job interview with a local, say, a fast food restaurant of sorts, and it was actually was offered a job today. And so, of course, I'm really excited about him. But I imagine if, like, you were to go to your first employer, or most any employer for that matter, and get upset with them for not providing a steak dinner every time you went into work. It's just it's just a kind of a confusing mentality to me. When we're there we're paid to be there to be a photographer, that should be the focus, and how we can best serve that client should be the focus. And there's no question we all need nutrition, but these expectations that we deserve or have certain rights, and I'll put those that word in quotes, I think is just a little bit, I don't know, I think the priorities aren't quite right. And I think the focus on making sure that we're there to serve the client, to be camouflaged, as you say, when necessary, to be an incredible person, more focused on a good relationship, focused on the friendship aspect of that interaction, being kind and helpful, again, not only to the clients, but also to the guests, can make such a big impact on how these people experience you as a photographer. Because as we've talked about in the podcast before, the number of times for myself as a photographer that people came up to me not having seen one image, but were lauding me for being an incredible photographer is just a fascinating study to me. And ultimately that speaks so loudly to the significance of the experience that we provide to our clients. That should be the focus, not the other stuff. And I think that you seem to have your priorities in the right place here. And I'm sure that translates to the experience that the clients have. This is a question that I ask quite a bit on the podcast, but I'm curious what the toughest lesson has been for you as a photography business owner so far. What comes to mind?
Yeah, that was a tough one, because I haven't had too many tough lessons, because I've tried to be very flexible.
That's interesting.
But recently, something just totally out of my hands came up, and I let it get to me. And I'll let you in on the story here a little bit. I recently shot a wedding. Last year I shot a wedding, and they booked me a month before their wedding. I did their engagement shoot a week before their wedding. And we had a great connection, a great relationship. I shot their wedding. That same thing. They thought I did such a great job, and they hadn't even seen the photos. You take that like a badge of honor.
Yeah, it's so cool.
Yeah. And the parents did it too. And typically what I do is the night I shoot a wedding, either the night or the next morning, I'll select 30 photos or so.
Sure.
And I'll do a quick edit, send out a sneak peek to them. So while they're on their honeymoon, they pull them up, and it's just that much better for their honeymoon. And I did that. And then I delivered the photos, and I was prepping their album to be delivered. And I got an email from them saying that they were very, very dissatisfied with my services. They were so unhappy, and they were going to pursue legal action.
Oh,
and
wow.
They were going to write the Better Business Bureau, and they wanted a 50% refund on all this. And I had no idea why. And it turns out, I have a drone, which I don't offer in my services or anything like that. While we met outside of this, because we had such a good relationship, I said, hey, I have, outside of the contract and everything, I said, hey, I have a drone. I'll bring it with us. And if we get a second, maybe we could throw it up and get a couple cool shots or a little video clip or something. And they're like, yeah, totally. That'll be fun. So during the first look, I threw it up, got 30 seconds of footage, like literally. And it wasn't even the first look. I photographed the first look. Then I had them re-walk it just to throw it up. It was a 2-minute, deal. And that was great. That was all the drone footage we got. And then after I delivered the photos, they were like, hey, what about that drone footage? I was like, yeah, I just finished the photos. I wanted to get that taken care of. So now we work in this. And it turned out that the, card was corrupted. It was just a little SanDisk card that comes with the drone, and it was corrupted, and the video didn't work. And so I tried to figure some stuff out, and they thought that was good enough reason to say that I did a terrible job and everything else.
Wow. Despite the fact that it wasn't in your contract.
Yeah. And I actually have a friend who's a lawyer, and I talked to him, and he was like, no, you're in perfect legal standing. I talked to another friend who's Mike, actually, who's a photographer, and he was like, no, this is really weird. And, it's not anything you promised. He's like, stuff like this happens. And regardless, I was shooting a wedding right after this happened. And the night before I was photographing the wedding, I got in my head, and I was thinking like, man, I feel like I'm not going to do a good job with this. And I was beating myself up about it. And my wife and I were talking about it, and she was like, hey, you did such a good job with that wedding. And they loved the photos. They ranted about it. They said that they were going to use me again in the past, and they looked forward to it. Their album looked amazing. It was really good. All this stuff was good. And then this random thing happens. It was totally out of my control. And I was beating myself up about it. And so I would say the hardest thing, lesson learned is to not get in my head, to not beat myself up about things like this. It's sometimes stuff happens, and you got to pick yourself up, and you got to persevere and push through it, and not really let it affect you too hard, because it is a business, and it not just business, but in life, stuff happens. We can choose to dwell on it, or we can choose to overcome it.
So good. Yeah, so true. But I'm curious also too, for the benefit of all of our listeners, how were you able to then kind of resolve that particular situation with the client?
So as far as my contract goes, I'm perfectly in the clear, and I'm fine in the clear. And as far as they go, I'm waiting to hear back from them. I've sent them the album and talked to them about, hey, I understand. And initially I told them, I was like, even though I wasn't responsible necessarily for the drone video, it wasn't a part of my contract or anything, I told them, I was like, hey, let me buy you some coffee, and let me just help you out. I want to make this right. I want you to be happy. and I was actually going to give them a free album. Out of my cost, I was just going to pay for an album for them, and they just haven't responded. So I'm not worried about it legally or anything like that. I'm in the clear, but I mean, I still want to make it right for them, but I'm not going to give them a refund, obviously.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me of this conversation that I had recently with Meredith Rinkars and her husband Jason on the Bokeh podcast. We were talking about how to have difficult conversations, and of course, this is something that happens as photography business owners, whether it's a relationship situation with another photographer, or maybe an employee, or a client, or whatever the case may be. But you run into situations like this that could mean some pretty difficult conversations. And the point that they made that was really interesting, or one of the points that was made that was really interesting, was the idea that photographers might ask themselves the question, are you, when they're responding to this situation, or maybe even trying to post about it on social media, are you trying to fight? Like, are these words that you're about to type and send an email or say out loud, maybe even to somebody over the phone or in person, or put out in social media, are you trying to fight? Is that what you're meaning to do with these words? And if not, then what are you trying to do? And maybe it begs a little bit of modification or editing of those things that you're about to say, so that you're actually being productive, that you're accomplishing something productive in that conversation. I love the fact that you were very, very proactive in trying to mend the relationship. You knew that you're in the right as far as the legal side of things, and you could have simply responded with, "Hey, you can't do anything to me legally. I followed through my contract." That would likely have been fighting words, at least from their perspective. But instead, you came back proactively and offered an additional value to them. And I think that goes to show how, well, it's a good example, if nothing else, for our listeners as to how they might be able to kind of minimize the potential problems that could come from a difficult relationship, especially, again, whether it's a client or another photographer, whatever the case, that it's important to look at the situation from as productive a mentality as possible and approach the conversation the way that you end up handling it that way. I think that's really, really important.
Well, and I think that goes back to, the entitlement thing, as a lot of photographers, like you were talking about, they expect this, and, you hired me, so I am entitled to ... And whenever for me, whenever I pursue something like this in conversation with people, I kind of mentally take a step back and say, am I edifying? Am I building someone up, or am I breaking them down? And those are the two routes that this can go. Yeah. It can be an edifying route, or it can be breaking someone down. And I kind of approach it a little selflessly. Obviously, I am protected, and, I do have rights in situations, and there are certain expectations. But when bigger picture, it's their wedding. I don't, regardless of if they were terrible people, which they weren't, and I think maybe something just happened. I don't know what yet, and I would love to know, so I can just help make that better for them, so they can have the best experience, because I think that's what's important. And I think that speaks multitudes to value and characters, that it's not about me. It's their wedding day. And I don't want to be the guy that ruins it, Well, and I think maybe there's an assumption innate to some of this so-called entitlement that, if you don't stand up for yourself, that you're going to get screwed over, that your business is ultimately going to suffer. And I would venture, and you're an example of this, but I would venture that this very proactive effort at making sure that the client has a positive experience actually pays off. Maybe not in the immediate situation. In some cases, it may feel like this person is hurting you or your business, but big picture, long term, I would venture that proactive mentality and that it makes all the difference in the world, actually, for the sake of your business and your business's reputation. People ultimately are going to know who you are. It's going to be reflected in the experience that you create for clients, and that's really, really important to keep in mind. Now, we're going to totally switch gears here, and I'm going to ask you a favorite piece of, we were talking about gear earlier. What is a favorite piece of gear? Camera body, a lens, a camera bag, an accessory of some kind. What is a favorite piece of gear that you just can't say enough about for our listeners? All right. Well, I recently got the A7R III by Sony. And Wow.
It's funny. We just had,
Wow.
I mentioned we had Mike Cologne on the podcast the other day, and
Yeah.
And actually, by the time this our conversation comes out on the Bokeh Podcast, Mike's will likely have aired, and he was ranting and raving in the most positive way possible about about the A7, and I think it was the R3.
Yeah.
He is a massive proponent. And did that have any effect on your choice to buy the camera?
Well, I'll just say this: Mike Cologne had massive effect on my choice too. I used to shoot Canon.
Yeah.
And Mike let me use his A7R2 a while ago. And I was like, all right, I'm selling all my Canon stuff. Sold it all.
Yeah.
And went A7R2. And then I just got the A7R3. And he was telling me, he was like, you got to get it. It's so fast. Like the A7R2 was fast, but you have to get the R3. It is stupid fast, and it really is. So as far as bodies go, I have the A7R3 with a battery grip, and then the 85 G Master, the 8514 G Master that Sony has is, it's just butter. It is so nice.
It's funny. I'm actually getting ready to buy some equipment for myself. I'm relaunching, or not relaunching, but starting a new photography brand. In addition
I heard about that.
to some of the other things I'm doing. And it's when I think about, I'm thinking about gear. What kind of lenses in particular am I going to purchase? And it makes me smile to even just hear you talk about this lens being butter, because stuff like that. I mean, when as powerful as the phones are that we have right now, and the incredible pictures that we can get with them,
Mm-hmm.
A beautiful lens with a shallow depth of field is one of those things that just kind of naturally sets apart a decent photograph from a really great photograph. It's one of the many elements, but you can just tell a difference. It just makes all the difference in the world with the way that an image can look. And even with the, I don't know, even what would you call it? The fake depth of field control that we have now with the phones. It's not quite the same. The kind of bokeh that you can get. In fact, I think about my favorite camera that I own currently is it's an old medium format film camera, and the bokeh from this Yashica twin lens camera that I can get in images is it's this gorgeous circular bokeh that I haven't really seen anywhere else. I mean, it's just absolutely stunning. But I totally know what you're talking about, and we're gonna geek out about gear. That is going to be one of the things that I would go on about is a really great lens. It really does make all the difference in the world.
Well, and I think the thing with the Sony gear too is you can transfer lenses, bring like Sony or Canon lenses or Nikon lenses over with a Metabones adapter, and they'll perform as good as they would on those cameras. But the performance of a Sony native lens like the 85 G Master, being able to use the eye autofocus with having that lens, it beats everything. If I can have for the rest of my life one body and lens, it would be that setup. This A7R3 and the 85 G Master. That
speaks volumes. All right. Well, we're going to at least link to those gear items in our show notes. So for those of you listening who aren't familiar with them, make sure you go check out those resources. Let's yet again kind of shift modes or directions here in our conversation and move into our topic for today, which centers around, a couple of big ideas. One is learning, and then the other is leadership. They certainly go hand in hand, but I think that good learning comes from genuine curiosity. This is actually something that I was reminded of by an old friend of mine. I was talking about the difficulty that I was having remembering information that I was taking in. And she pointed out, if you're actually interested in it, if you really enjoy it, it's going to be a lot less difficult to actually remember something than when you feel like you're forced to take in information, right? So I think that genuine curiosity that drives learning makes all the difference in the world, and the way that we grow in certainly our knowledge, but then ideally in our intelligence as well, our ability to be able to connect pieces of information that we're taking in. What topics are you most curious about? Maybe especially when it comes to photography and business, what are those things that you find yourself exploring the most? So
I think right now there's two endeavors that I'm really focusing on. One is skin tones. It irks me. It makes my skin crawl when I see a picture and it's a great picture, but the green and all the greenery and trees have bled into the skin tones, and people are green.
Dare we say too that a lot of the presets you were talking about that the popularity of the film look for the last really number of years, but some of those presets, it's amazing the amount of green tint that those presets lend to an image, and photographers just seem to be okay with that right now.
I know, and I think that's why I don't like a lot of them.
Yeah.
Hey, but if that's you, that's fine.
Oh, sure. Yeah, to each his own for sure. But it's just an interesting thing to see. I mean, especially having been in the industry now for close to 20 years myself, like see the trends, what comes and goes, what is popular and then isn't anymore.
Totally.
And I also experienced too just personally as a photography business owner, kind of following some of these fads. And then in a very short period of time, looking back and saying, like, what in the world was I doing?
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, like you said, you want to be able to look back at those images and they do stand the test of time. And green skin tones, maybe not the best idea. But I don't mean to get us too far off topic. So you said you're obsessed with skin tones and trying to figure out ultimately how to render your images with more accurate skin tones, or what is it?
Yeah. To get better skin tones, to get the best skin tones. I think I do a pretty decent job of it. But along that line, I'll take, photos from other photographers where I like their skin tones. I like what they do. I'll take a screenshot of that, and then I'll just pull out my computer and take a photo and try to match those skin tones, not to copy them, but so I develop my skill a bit more. And so I think that is going to be an ever-long pursuit that I keep going. It's going to be the one thing that I will always keep doing, is trying to get better looking skin tones.
Huh, that's interesting. What about something on kind of a bigger picture level when it comes to running a photography business? What are you most curious about? Yeah,
so when it comes to running a photography business, one thing I'm learning to do is really to, I guess, manage it.
Ah, yeah, that's a huge topic.
Yeah, and taking the photos and doing all that creative side of, it kind of comes a little more naturally. And being more of a creative person, learning how to be more disciplined, how to, maybe not be the perfectionist that I want to be, and manage my business better. And a lot of that management side of things comes down to, right now for me, is some marketing, developing my website, getting it, where I want it to be, where it needs to be, budgeting time. Yeah. So it's management, and that's one endeavor that I'm in.
And yet again, we've hit on another topic that could be really multiple episodes in the making, because this is a really loaded topic, but I find it interesting. And it's not something that I realized until kind of much later in my entrepreneurial career, which is that we as photographers, I mean, even when it comes down to, you mentioned Photographers Edit earlier, and for those listening in who aren't familiar with Photographers Edit, it's a company that I started a number of years ago, about a decade ago actually, that offers editing services to professional wedding, or really event photographers and portrait photographers. And one of the difficult things when it comes to delegating or outsourcing editing work to another company is the process of communication. And what I realized, I finally made this connection a little while back, which was the idea of learning how to communicate or delegate ultimately something is a skill that's required by a manager. And so it really is important to look at, and not just for the sake of learning how to be a better communicator and ultimately delegator, to free up time in your life as a business owner, but ultimately to look at yourself as a manager, and to treat your business as such, rather than treating yourself as an employee. And I think this may even be something that was spoken to in a book that I've mentioned on the podcast before, called The E-Myth Revisited. And this book focuses on how to build a scalable business. You can't effectively grow and ultimately scale your business if you're treating yourself like an employee instead of a manager, somebody looking from the top down, versus just kind of being stuck in the day-to-day, constantly reacting to whatever may be coming your way. That's more the mentality of an employee. It's really, truly important to be outside of that and to function as a manager. And it's a loaded topic, and we're barely even going to scratch the surface of the idea. But I do recommend that book, and we'll link to it in the show notes. But yeah, what were you going to say, Morgan?
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, to help some people, one resource as far as managing that I've come across has been wildly helpful is a Skillshare. I think it's like $100 a year or something like that. But they have, an array of topics. But I'll get on there, and while I'm editing photos or something, I'll throw on videos on accounting, on management, on scheduling, and all these things. And they'll have loads of courses that you can just watch videos, and they have, do their courses, and they have homework assignments and stuff. But that's been very helpful as far as the managing endeavor and learning how to manage my business better.
Well, and it's important to note here too. I mean, it's really good for a business owner, an entrepreneur, to be aware of at least the basics of the various topics associated with, or the requirements associated with running a business. I think that is really, really important. Where I would personally draw the line, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, but there's a certain point at which me trying to know all the information about all the topics ultimately is detrimental to my effort to reach my personal kind of long-term goals, because it's going to force me to get stuck in the weeds, right? So having a basic understanding of those elements of your business, the numbers, certainly, even, I mean, as an editing company owner, I would still recommend to photographers be aware of how to use that software, because whether it's knowing how to get the images back from an editing company and then push those into your workflow or out to your clients, or how to quickly edit a few images if you have to do that in the moment. Having a basic knowledge of that software and how to go about that process is still important. It's good to have a surface level knowledge of many things, but it's also important then, again, speaking to the idea of being a manager, to also then delegate. So whether it's accounting or album design or editing or so many of these elements of our business, there are resources available, especially in 2018, that we can take advantage of that will help us more effectively manage our company. We don't have to do it all ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, and that's huge. If you're like me and it's pretty much just you or a couple people you may hire, you could be a jack of all trades and a master of none. Right. And so being able to have something like Photographers Edit and sending that off is a great help. But there's, I think, as far as is to be a little more tangible with the management side of things, you have to prioritize what you want to learn, what you want to do. And what I do for that is I'll pick one thing. Like let's say we'll go on the topic of accounting. Okay, so let me learn a bit more about what it means to be an accountant, and I need to learn QuickBooks. Okay, so let me take QuickBooks, and this is the one thing I'm going to focus on with this. I'm not going to get into the other stuff because I want QuickBooks to become muscle memory before I move on to something else, and then kind of letting that develop, and it's for me, it's been helpful. Absolutely. Well, again, there's quite a significance to awareness around these topics. This is something that I've talked about before in the podcast, but especially when it came to the books and the numbers and managing my finances as a business owner proactively, and for that matter, personally, especially as a young photographer, I would kind of stick my head in the sand rather than being proactive and developing a certain amount of knowledge around the topic, and then ultimately taking advantage, of course, of the resources that are out there that would help me, i.e. an accountant or CPA. Yeah. And it's important that we do that same thing as well. But you mentioned Skillshare as a resource. Talk to us a little bit about the educational resources. When we're talking about this idea of learning as a photographer, learning as a business owner, it's so important that we do continue to grow. What are some of the additional resources that you found are most beneficial for your growth around photography and business? Podcasts. Podcasts are huge. That's a huge resource. It helps me stay inspired. Yeah. Looking at other photographers, I'll go out and I'll Seattle wedding photographer, fashion photographer, and not being limited to just wedding inspiration, but gathering inspiration from all these, different areas, taking them down and pursuing it. And, how can I incorporate this? Why am I inspired by this picture? Why am I inspired by this color palette? What do I like about this thing right here? And then figuring that out and learning how I can apply it. Yeah, and before we actually started recording, you'd actually mentioned a couple of other resources too. We were talking about the simple practicality of taking advantage of resources like YouTube. You'd mentioned that had made a big difference for you. I mean, even Google. It may seem like an obvious thing, but I've been kind of interested over the years seeing questions posted on a Facebook group or otherwise about
information that is readily available if somebody is willing to just go to Google and do a quick search, or go to YouTube and do a quick search. We have incredible resources available to us right now that enable us to be able to tackle pretty much any problem relatively easily if we're just willing to make the effort, the kind of the proactive effort to do just that.
Yeah. Well, and Skillshare was one of those things. You dove into it and just started looking. Google, YouTube. I mean, there's been countless times where I'm wondering, hey, how do I use Kelvin?
Yeah.
How do I best use that? What are the different temperatures? What does that mean? Why does it work that way? And I'll go into YouTube and listen to someone talk about it. And then I'll find another video and listen to someone else talk about it. And then I'll go and try it and apply it. Sometimes I'll, reach out to a friend, talk to Mike or talk to Trevor or someone else, and Trevor Honey. And I'll, say, hey, how does this work? How do you do this? What, I saw you did this. That's really cool. What was your inspiration for that? And then just grow with that, learn with that. Even reaching out to people who maybe you don't know or have a relationship with. Like one guy, Nick Onken, when I became a photographer, just came across him and started following him. He had a blog, Shop Talk, where he'd post things all the time, just how to run your photography business. And he has a podcast out now called Neon Radio. And I listen to it all the time and just draw inspiration from that and learn. And it's really great. And there's actually, he's a Washington native. He lives out in New York now, I believe. But there was one time I was just driving in Bellevue in Washington, and I see Nick Onken just walking down the road, and I'm at a stop sign, like, Nick Onken? And he was like, hey, it's like, I'm a wedding photographer. I've drawn a lot of inspiration from you. I think what you do is amazing. Can I buy you coffee sometime? And he was like, yeah, I'm out here for a week. Email me. And so I emailed him. We sat down with he and his dad and just picked his brain, heard what he's up to lately, and it was awesome. But just, it's okay to reach out to someone. And I think that could be some of the most insightful stuff. You'll learn a lot, but you can also develop a good relationship that can actually help you or them even more. But don't be afraid to just call someone up or reach out to them.
Yeah, it's these conversations can easily start virtually, online, through text, whatever the case may be. But I can't say enough about the significance of actually making the effort to get together with people in person. To get, whether it's coffee or meet for lunch or do brunch or do drinks or dinner or whatever it might be. But make the effort to get off your butt and get out from behind the computer and go actually connect with people in person. There's nothing to replace it. No question. I mean, the benefit, for example, back in the day as a photographer, as an active photographer, one of my favorite resources for learning was a forum, an online forum that I was a part of that ended up turning into this massive, massive forum, thousands of photographers. But obviously, that was very virtual in nature. We had the opportunity, myself and my business partner at the time had the opportunity to be able to develop relationships virtually, which were then carried over into in-person interactions at get-togethers in various parts of the country. And the relationships that came out of that were really incredible, but they didn't stop at the computer. They turned into in-person get-togethers, it's interesting. Like you'll hear or read photographers complaining about making a drive across town, for example, to get together with, they're not willing to make that effort. But these photographers were literally traveling cross-country in order to connect with these photographers. We even had one of the get-togethers for the OSP, the Open Source Photo Forum here in Chattanooga. People flew into Chattanooga, traveled to Chattanooga, and made the effort to connect with their friends in person.
Yeah,
there's not enough that could be said about that, and again, the benefit, the value that comes from those types of interactions as a business owner, just absolutely amazing. I certainly benefited from it, and I know others will as well. That idea, that community over competition idea, it's not just a saying, that the Rising Tide Society came up with. It has legitimate value. And for those listening in, you got to take advantage of it.
It does. And I think that's huge, community over competition. I think competition is good and healthy, and that's great. But if your goal in life is to win, if your goal in life is, to be the best, it's in anything. I mean, to be the best, you have to put someone else down. Now, there's good, healthy competition. That's totally fine. But if you are doing that in life, you're never going to have community. And community, I think, is almost the opposite of that. Community is other people helping you be better, or you helping other people be better, which I think, as far as, leadership goes, if you want to help someone, help them be better at what they're doing or be a leader, I think that's a very important thing.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is a kind of a perfect segue into this topic of leadership. We were talking about the idea of learning, and then ultimately how that fuels leadership. I mean, so much of leadership, I don't know. I think, like, when I hear the word leadership, one of the pictures that comes to mind automatically, for whatever reason, maybe it's just my past experience, is this person like standing up on a stage, kind of shouting out or yelling out, or even just speaking out to me as this icon, this almost unreachable individual who is leading. Yeah. And that's really not the case. I mean, you very accurately pointed out that a lot of leadership is just simply helping others, looking for opportunities to be able to lead others. And that could be in something as simple as, how do you set up your camera to use it more effectively? Yeah. Where does your desire to lead or to help others come from?
I think we all have certain qualities of our character that just are natural within us. And I would say my main one is service, is being a servant. And I think if you can be a good servant, then you can be a better leader. One thing with leadership that I always strive for is to not lead someone to be almost as good as me. I feel like that's not, that's counterintuitive. It defeats the purpose of leading someone. I want to lead someone to do better things than I have, to be a better person than I am, to have a better marriage than I have. And I have a great marriage. I love my wife, but if I can help someone have a better marriage than me, I'm all in. If I could help someone be a better photographer than me, count me in. I want to be there, and I want to do that. And I think that's, if you have that mindset with a leader, the rest is going to fall in place, and it's going to work out, because your pursuit isn't you. Your pursuit is them. And I guess that brings us to my, what a leader is, kind of you asked me that question earlier, and it was, what are a couple things that make a leader? And it would be humility and drive for me. There's a million different things that you can say a leader needs to have, but I think two important things is humility and drive. Humility, because you need to build others up. And that's the purpose of leaders, to build them up to do better and greater things than you. And drive, because you can't be a good leader if you're not pursuing that, if you're not actively going out and leading. So I would say that's huge.
Yeah, both of those are huge. And by the way, I love the way that you describe this notion of leadership being focused on helping others do better than you. I'm not sure that I've quite heard anyone describe it that way before. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful picture, and it's something that in some form or fashion we should all strive for as just human beings. Forget the fact that we're entrepreneurs, photography business owners. As human beings, we really should take our experiences and in some form or fashion be able to pour what we've learned from those experiences into others for the sake of them having a better life. I mean, so much of my job as a parent, I think, centers around that very notion. Yeah. And it's been a really fascinating experience and enjoyable experience, ultimately, to be able to do that for the sake of my kids. You talked about drive to do this very thing, but when I think about drive, too, I think about the drive to learn. And again, tying this back to the notion of learning and growing, one of my values, one of the ways that I feel best as a human being is when I grow. And so I think a drive to learn also is really important to this conversation around leadership, because if we have a drive to learn, if we're naturally curious, like we were talking about earlier, we're curious to learn, we grow as a result. We'll experience the benefits of that growth. We're going to be that much more passionate to help others have that same feeling, that same experience, which again is innate to this idea, as you're describing, about being an effective leader.
The two go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
Learning and leadership.
And what would you say then would be, I mean, again, to make it even more tangible for our listeners, how does, I think, I would assume anyway, that most photography business owners, including many of our listeners, wouldn't naturally think about the idea of being a leader. I mean, so many photographers, in fact, will say, I'm just an introvert. So the idea of being a leader isn't something that just automatically comes to mind as a photography business owner, that they would think being a leader would enable them to be a better photography business owner. It's just not something they need to be concerned about. Would you agree with that? And if being a leader can help them, how will it help them?
Well, I think there's a couple things there. First of all, I don't think it matters if you're an introvert or an extrovert. It may matter to the extent of how many people you lead at once. But even if you're an introvert, you still have some relationships. You still have, one or two people that you can help lead. And, it takes persistence, and sometimes you got to psych yourself up about it. But I don't think it should matter if you're an introvert or an extrovert. I'm very, very much an extrovert. So it comes a little more naturally for me. But on the other hand, learning helps you lead. But in the same sense, as you lead, you learn. There's been so many people who, you can hear and say, yeah, I've learned more being a teacher than I have being a student, or I've learned more leading someone than I have, following someone. So I think it's important, and if you want to learn more, if you want to grow, help people out, learn. And you in turn will learn from that, or lead, and you in turn will learn from that. And I think that's huge. But I mean, if there's one thing I could say about this, is just do it. Just go out and do it. Don't wait for doors to open. Look for them to close. Just keep going forward. And if a door closes, it closes. Maybe you need to open it. It's a door. You can open a closed door. But be proactive about it and pursue it.
Yeah, and I think that's a great note to end on. We've hit some really, really big principles and ideas today that really kind of deserve their own individual podcast episodes, at least one. But it's good that we're closing on yet another important idea, which is the significance of just doing. Because there is a tendency, and again, I'm guilty of it multiple times over, of holding back, of not doing something for fear of it not being just right or just perfect, or what if I screw up, or what if this goes wrong, or what if this happens, what if that happens. And as a result, we miss out on so many incredible opportunities that could have come from just moving, just doing. And you may have to correct course. Yeah, you may have to make adjustments. Maybe it doesn't come out perfect the first time or the second time or the third time, whatever it may be. But in that process, you learn. And then, as we're talking about, you have the opportunity to lead. And I'm glad that you used the word help there at the end, because really what we're talking about largely with leadership is the notion of helping others. We learn from experience. We're able to share that with others. They benefit as a result. And we're all just better for it. And so do, but then take advantage of those opportunities and learning from doing to help others. Let them in on what you've learned from those experiences. And not only will they grow and learn and ultimately be better for it, but you will as well. This has ultimately been a really powerful conversation, Morgan. And again, we've touched on multiple topics that deserve to be dove into for more than just an hour. But for the time being, I'd love for you to share where our listeners can find you online. They can follow what you're doing. And maybe if they have follow-up questions or conversation, they can reach out to you as well.
Yeah, definitely. My website is themorgantaylor.com, and that's THE-morgantaylor.com. You can email me there if you have questions. I think my phone number's on there. Feel free to send me a text. If you call, I may not answer. I may let it go to voicemail. But feel free to send me a text if you have questions. And then I think I am most active on Instagram, which is at @themorgantaylor. Again, that's THE Morgan Taylor. Feel free to DM me.
Perfect.
Follow me and let's talk.
Perfect. We will link to those resources in our show notes as well. Again, just very simply, themorgantaylor.com and at @themorgantaylor, THEMORGANTAYLOR. And we'll link to that in the show notes. Thanks again so much, Morgan, for making time to share with the Bokeh Podcast today.
Nathan, thanks for having me. It was so much fun.
Thanks so much for listening to the Bokeh Podcast today. Will you let us know what you think by leaving a review of the podcast in iTunes or maybe in the Apple Podcast app? And I'd love to hear from you personally with your thoughts about the podcast, maybe suggestions about future topics and guests for the show. My direct email is nathan@photographersedit.com. The Bokeh Podcast is brought to you by Photographers Edit, custom image editing for the wedding and portrait photographer. Just visit photographersedit.com.